And for tonight's lecture, we have our own Associate Research Scientist, Dr. Randy Rogen, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Gina. So many people out on a rainy night. You guys have made a good choice because it is an honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Anne Cohen, who will be speaking this evening. Anne is, what's your official title, a tenured associate scientist at Woods Hole, where she has been for quite a long time. She actually did her postdoc there and has stayed there for a while, ever since after doing her Ph.D. at the University of Cape Town. Anne's research focuses on climate change and its impact on ocean life everywhere. She has a huge lab, and they have done really groundbreaking work, pioneering new technologies and new methods to look at coral skeletons, using them almost as tree rings to glimpse into the past, to understand what the climate record has been in coral reefs all over the world, ranging from the Red Sea to the Central Pacific to the Atlantic. She's really a world traveler, and the corals have a really interesting story to tell, and I'm sure she's going to tell it to you. Of consequence to the aquarium, Anne is also a collaborator of mine and of the New England Aquariums, and will be responsible for leading one of the teams going on the upcoming Phoenix Islands expedition this coming June. Phoenix Islands are a remote part of the Central Pacific and a natural climate change laboratory, which the aquariums have the honor of working with and helping to create the world's largest marine World Heritage Site. So Anne is a close friend, a collaborator, and it is an absolute honor to have her speak with us this evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Randy, for that great introduction, and it's really a thrill for me to be here today. I don't often get a chance to talk with such a broad audience and to share some of the real science that we do. What I'm going to do today is talk about human-induced climate change, and a particular part of that called ocean acidification, which is really being driven by the absorption of excess carbon dioxide by the oceans. And I'm going to talk about how coral reefs are responding to these changes and the kind of work that we're doing across the global oceans to monitor and try to understand how coral reefs are coping with these changes in ocean chemistry. So what I'm going to do is start with some an introduction to coral reefs, to the ecosystem services that they provide, why they're important. Then I'm going to tell you something about corals that you probably didn't already know. I'm going to show you how special they are, what kinds of calcium carbonate crystals they make, and how they build reefs. And this is really the bottom line for corals, why corals care about how much carbon dioxide is being absorbed into the ocean. And I've chosen this slide to start. Do we want to turn the lights down a little bit? This is actually an aerial picture of 70 islands, a group of islands in a coral reef archipelago called Palau, which is just north of Papua New Guinea, about 4 hours flight south of Japan, and on the same latitude as Borneo. And I was just there with 5 of my group studying the coral reefs of Palau. And it's really a spectacular example of what corals do. Palau is a spectacular example of how corals build some of the most beautiful, magical places on Earth. The coral reefs that we know today, or with the composition, the types of corals that build coral reefs today, have been around for about 50 million years. And what I mean when I say today's reefs, I mean coral algal dominated reefs. So these reefs are built by reef building corals. But the corals that we go scuba diving on, or snorkeling on, or fishing on, have only been around for a few thousand years. And that is related to where the sea level is today. But over those thousands of years, corals are making calcium carbonate skeletons, and their skeletons are being accumulated into mass constructions, which then form what you see in this picture, the coral reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. And some reefs, some of these calcium carbonate accumulations, some of these accumulations of coral skeletons are so massive that they can be seen from space. And you can see in this NASA image which is actually taken from one of their satellites, quite a lot of definition on these coral reef islands off of the coast of northern Queensland. And every year, millions and millions of people from around the world visit coral reefs to snorkel, to fish, to scuba dive, to have a great holiday. And those people bring, for those coral reef countries, an estimated $375 billion in revenue every year. So coral reefs have an intrinsic economic value. But coral reefs aren't just amazing tourist destinations. You look at this plot, this map that I've made for you, which shows in the yellow squares all the coral reefs in the world and where they are. You can see they're concentrated across the global tropics. And even though there looks to be a lot of reef area, coral reefs in fact only occupy less than 1% of the seafloor. And yet, they harbor a quarter of all the species in the ocean. 25% of marine species are found on coral reefs. The census for coral reef ecosystems is still counting. They are putting out little systems called cows, which capture benthic organisms and things that are living on reefs. And they're using a combination of tools, including molecular techniques, to identify new species. And just recently, about 200 new species were identified. But this census has estimated that coral reefs harbor up to 9 million species of organisms. That's incredible. Of the reef-building corals alone, these are the corals that build hard skeletons that when you swim or snorkel across the reef, you can see them often, the Acropora, the tabletop corals, or the big mountain corals. Those are the reef-building corals. Those are the ones that are actually building that reef. There are over 700 different species of just the reef-building corals. And this doesn't include the gorgonians or the sea fans, or the black corals or the red corals. These are just the reef-building corals, 700 species. Over 8,000 species of fish are found in coral reefs. Use coral reefs to lay their eggs, grow their babies. That's a staggering amount of just fish species. And this is a really important coral reef species, a Goliath grouper. And many marine protected areas of coral reefs are actually designed to protect this fish, the Goliath grouper and other kinds of groupers. When it comes to people, 25% of all the fish that are consumed by people come from coral reefs. And this isn't only in developing countries. This is also in Florida, Gulf of Mexico, Hawaii, first world countries. And all this is made possible by tiny, relatively simple organisms called polyps. And they really are simple. The coral polyp is basically a double-walled sac. So you can think of 2 Ziploc bags, one inside the other, filled with water, and in between those 2 bags is a thick layer of jelly called the mesoglia. And that's basically what a coral polyp is. And you can see in this image some polyps of a Caribbean coral, Montastra cavernosa. And you can see that they're colonial. That means there's many of them that all live together. In fact, these polyps are all stuck together with a layer of membrane called the coenoarch. So they're all in constant communication with each other. you look at coral polyps, you can see that they look very much like sea anemones. And in fact, they're related to sea anemones. This polyp here, you can see it has a mouth. And the mouth is to capture prey and also to let out what it doesn't use. The mouth is surrounded by tentacles. And those tentacles are armed with stinging cells called nematocysts. And they can capture and paralyze prey that then get drawn into the polyp's mouth. Now, I don't know how many of you regularly go snorkeling on reefs or diving, but if you run your hand over a coral when the polyps are out, you'll get stung. And some of us, like me, are actually quite sensitive to that sting and can come out in quite a big rash. And often when I come home, like I did last week from Palau, I'm covered in all little rashes. Now, it's kind of like my war wounds from going out in the field. And they can get quite itchy. But there's a very important thing, a critical thing in fact, that distinguishes these coral polyps from their cousins, the sea anemones. And that critical distinction is that they make calcium carbonate skeletons. Day in and day out, 24/7, these polyps are working a magical thing. They're making calcium carbonate crystals. If you run your hand over these polyps, they'll contract. They'll contract into their skeleton. And this picture that I took on Bermuda when we were filming with the BBC last year shows you very nicely how those Montastraea cavernosa polyps contract. As soon as they saw me, actually, I didn't even have to touch them. They just saw me and they contracted right into their skeletons. So what you see there are the white tentacles sticking out of the mound of calcium carbonate skeleton that those polyps have built to house themselves. And it is these skeletons, millions and millions upon millions of generations and generations of corals, and all the different species of corals, the mounding, the branching, accumulating together over thousands of years. That's what builds a reef. That's what houses the fish. That one contains 25% of the diversity of the ocean. It's those skeletons that are built by those tiny little animals, those Ziploc bags, one inside of the other. And this all starts when the mother polyp releases her eggs. And usually this happens just before or around the full moon, during the warmest time of the year. You can see here the mother polyp of Montastraea cavernosa, the coral that I'm talking about, releasing her eggs, a string of them. And she'll continue to do that throughout the night over several days. And all her friends are doing the same thing in the colony. And in the next whole colony, they're all doing the same thing. And the whole reef is doing the same thing, all at the same time. And then you get what's called mass spawning events. And if you go swimming on the reef during mass spawning events, you're basically swimming through clouds of eggs and sperm that have been released by these corals. Looks something like that. Now this image is a little grainy because we took it under the microscope. But this is what you see after 24 hours, after the eggs and sperm have found each other in the water and fertilized and built a planula larva. So basically, once fertilization has occurred, it takes about 24 hours to form a planula larva, swimming around, a little worm, about 1 millimeter long and loaded with fat. These creatures are about 70% fat. And they need to be, because it's going to be a while, a few days at least, before they can eat anything. And there's another thing about this larva that I want you to see. You see these green dots? Those green dots are really important. Those are the symbiotic algae that live in the coral tissue. And in this species, the babies are born with their mother's algae. They get a subset. They get a loan. And the planular larva finds a nice place on the reef. We actually watch these under the microscope. And you can see what they're doing. They're these little 1 millimeter worms swimming around. They have personalities. And what they do is they, after about 24 hours, they start diving down. So say this is the reef surface. They dive down, and then they start sniffing around for a place to live. And you'd be amazed how picky they are. This little blob of fat, that little blob of fat, very picky. But once they've found a place that they like, then they'll undergo a metamorphosis. And after about 3 days, what you see is a fully formed little coral polyp, like this. And there's its mouth, and there's its little tentacles, and it's full of green stuff. That's what gives it the color. And that green stuff are the symbiotic algae, the little plant cells that live inside the coral skeleton, the coral tissue. This is what they look like. These algae, they're actually called zooxanthellae, have been isolated from the polyp for study. And you can see them, quite discrete little plant cells. And what those plant cells do, they actually perform a very important function for the coral. They fix carbon. They use carbon dioxide from the water to perform photosynthesis. And they provide the products of that photosynthesis, called photosynthate, to the coral. So in exchange for the algae having a refuge inside the coral cell, the algae perform photosynthesis and actually feed the coral. And most of the reef-building corals get their primary nutrition from their symbiotic algae. So these algae need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis to feed the corals. So our coral reefs need carbon dioxide. Now, because the polyp is born with a lot of fat, and it's also born with its symbiotic algae, the algae that are going to photosynthesize and feed it, they can, once they hit that reef, they can grow really, really fast. And after about 3 weeks, we're seeing not one primary polyp, but this guy has divided and divided and divided again. And now we're seeing from that single polyp, that single planular larvae that metamorphosed after 3 weeks, we're now seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 polyps. And you can imagine in your head this continuing for more weeks and months and years until we get a huge coral colony that is then going to go on and build the reef. Now this isn't as scary as it looks. There's a really important thing going on at the same time. At the same time as these algae are photosynthesizing and fixing carbon and feeding the coral and dividing from 1 mouth to 8 mouths. Those polyps, those primary polyps, are performing another very important function. They're combining calcium ions, the green dot, with carbonate ions, the red and beige dots, that are already existing in the seawater. They're combining them together to form calcium carbonate, which is this molecule that you see here. And it's not just any kind of calcium carbonate. This is actually a special formation, a special arrangement of the calcium and the carbonate ions into a structure that's called a aragonite. And aragonite is the kind of calcium carbonate that all corals make. That is what reefs are built of. Baby's first steps, well, in this case, baby's first skeleton. They're pulling those calcium and carbonate ions together and making calcium carbonate molecules to perform a very specific function, and that is to build a skeleton. That's what they do. That's what they're driven to do. So here's our 3-day-old polyp with its aliquot of symbiotic algae from its mom, its mouth, and its tentacles that capture prey. And underneath, it's building the most intricate, beautiful, perfect skeleton. And this skeleton is what's going to fix it to the reef, so that when waves come through, it doesn't get dislodged from the substrate. It's also going to push the coral polyp up off the bottom, so that when algae, turf algae, grow like grass. You know when your grass grows in the summer and you just have to mow it? Well, that's what happens on the reef as well. Turf algae come in. And if the coral doesn't grow fast enough, the turf algae will just grow over it. So the other critical purpose of this skeleton is to help the coral polyp get up off the bottom of the reef and out of the way of those algae. When the baby coral gets big enough, and its skeleton is big enough, it'll actually be able to retract into it. And that's what I showed you in the previous slide, where I showed you that mound coral cavernosa with the polyps. That's the size that you want to get to, so that you can take refuge. When a parrotfish comes along, you can take refuge in that skeleton. Now, I introduced you to the calcium carbonate crystals that the corals are making from day 3. Beautiful. From that little worm full of fat, in 3 days, beautiful skeleton. Amazing. It's doing that by combining those calcium and carbonate ions together into crystals in the form of aragonite. But these are not just any crystals. Corals make very special crystals. And this is a scanning electron microscope image of those crystals. Now we have to use a big fancy machine to see those crystals because they're very tiny. This scale bar here is 1 micron, that's 1,000th of a millimeter. These crystals are tiny. But the coral puts them together with such care. Look at them, they're all facing the same direction. They're all about the same size. They're grouped into perfect bundles. And this is what happy corals do. They build these beautiful calcium carbonate crystals in an amazing organization. And they're doing this day in, day out, day and night. And we know that because there are day-night growth rings in the skeleton. And you can see these bands. I don't have a pointer, unfortunately, but I could use one. Let's see. These bands here are daily growth bands in that baby coral skeleton. So we can actually use those bands to count how old the coral is. But this also shows us that the skeleton is very well organized in terms of its crystals. These aren't just haphazard crystals just laid down any old how. This coral is taking great care, thank you, to build its skeleton. Now I just have to figure out what this is, how do you use this. I don't think I know how. I can do that. Thank you. Now Now there's another thing that's really, really important. Oh, I saw it. There's another very important thing that I have to tell you about corals and how incredible they are. And how this simple organism, this tiny organism that's about 1 millimeter in size, is building these reefs with these amazing crystals that have put so much care into making. This is the rate of calcium carbonate production on the y-axis. Just look at the numbers, 20,000. Okay? The actual units don't matter. Corals, these are all the coral data we have, are making calcium carbonate crystals at this rate, between 15 and 20,000. If we grow crystals from the lab in the from seawater in the lab, that's what we can do. You take seawater off here, off the wharf, in a beaker, and set it on a table, and you will wait about 90 years before anything happens. It's not funny, we can't actually grow crystals very fast. So corals are doing an amazing thing in that they're producing these crystals not only in a highly organized fashion, but they're doing it incredibly fast. They're producing crystals 20,000 times faster than we can do it in the lab. These tiny little polyps. And that's really important for reef building. Corals have to produce crystals, calcium carbonate crystals, really, really fast in order to reproduce what is getting naturally eroded away from the reef. They have to be constantly putting new calcium carbonate into the reef, and they need to do it at these rates in order for coral reefs that we dive on to survive. Now remember I told you that the calcium carbonate crystals are made from calcium ions and carbonate ions in the seawater that the coral puts together to make a calcium carbonate molecule. Okay? Now there's plenty of calcium in the seawater. We're not worried about how much calcium there is in the seawater. The rate of growth, the rate of production of the calcium carbonate by these corals is very, very dependent on the carbonate ions, on how many carbonate ions there are. And today, in order for corals to make the kind of crystals that they do, at the rates they do, we need 240 micromoles per kilogram of seawater. The units don't matter. I just want you to remember that number. 240 of those. Guess what? What we're doing in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions, in terms of our fossil fuel burning, we're altering the amount of carbon ions in the seawater. And I'm going to show you how that happens. Every year, humans pump billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Billions of tons. I'm going to show you a graph just of the last 10 years of carbon dioxide emissions from humans. Okay, just the last 10 years. This unit is petagram. That's 1 million tons. 1 petagram is 1 million tons. Here in 1998, we were around 6 million tons, or 6 petagrams. Check this out. And we only stopped a little bit there because there was a global recession. It's amazing, huh, what a global recession can do. You can actually see it. It's measurable. Carbon dioxide emissions actually dipped right there. But in fact, the rate of carbon dioxide emissions by humans is was 3 times higher in the last decade than it was in the decade before. 3 times higher. We talk about carbon caps and carbon emissions, ha. Nothing of the sort is happening. We are just producing more. And more, at a greater rate. And you can ask yourself, well, where does all this carbon dioxide go? Well, 2 sources. One is from deforestation. Actually, deforestation, cutting down trees, Amazon, releases a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the rest coming from fossil fuel burning. And that is partitioned 4 petagrams, 4 billion tons, going into the atmosphere. And we all heard about greenhouse warming. Well, that's what that is doing. It's almost like this carbon dioxide kind of goes different places and does different things. So when it goes into the atmosphere, it creates a blanket around the Earth. The sunlight comes in, can't get out. We're heating up. We all know that. 2.8 petagrams is getting absorbed by trees, or what's left of them. And 2.2 petagrams, 2 billion tons, or about 25 to 30% of the CO2 emissions are going into the ocean. Now for the land and for the atmosphere, that's a good thing. Because we're not as hot as we would be otherwise. In fact, I could do with some hot weather right now. Coming from Palau, it's really cold here. But the oceans are taking up 25 to 30% of the sea carbon dioxide that we're releasing into the atmosphere every time we drive a car, fly a plane, run a factory. And what does carbon dioxide do? Well, it's not inert. When the carbon dioxide goes into the ocean, it actually combines with water and the carbonate ions that are there, that the corals really need to build coral reefs. The carbon dioxide runs around and looks for the carbonate ion to bind with. And in doing so, it produces a different kind of carbon species called bicarbonate. And these bicarbonates, the corals can't use. They can't use them to make their skeletons. And we've tried. We fed them with teaspoons of sugar, the bicarbonate, and they don't want it. And you know what else? All shell-building species with calcium carbonate shells that you can think of don't want that bicarbonate either. They all want the carbonate ions, the shellfish, the oysters, the clams, the mussels, the lobsters, the crayfish. What else do we eat? King crabs, shrimp. They all want those carbonate ions. And I work a lot in my sciencey lab, trying to figure out why they want the carbonate ions and why they don't want the bicarbonate. That's another story. But the fact is that when the atmospheric carbon dioxide that we're producing gets sucked up by the ocean, all those carbonate ions that everybody wants, get turned into bicarbonate ions that nobody wants. It's kind of like you can't eat money. I think that's a good analogy. Okay, so unfortunately I have another plot because I really wanted to show you what's actually going on. All right? This is the start of the Industrial Revolution about 160 years ago, 162 years ago, right there. And the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere were about 280 ppm, parts per million. And they've been 280 parts per million for the last million years. Okay? And then we came along and we started to burn fossil fuels, and woo, things started to go up. And here we are right here at about 400 ppm. So we're already almost double what we're supposed to be. And then, if we continue doing what we're doing, we're going to hit about 650 ppm. In fact, the carbon dioxide trend that we're on right now, we're projected to hit 1,000 parts per million by the end of this century. This is an old plot. It's been updated. It's now right up here. Okay, so this is carbon dioxide going up. And this is what's happening to the ocean. The ocean pH has been, for the last million years, about 8.2. And as the ocean has absorbed all this excess carbon dioxide, the pH is declining. And there's the carbon ion concentration right there, the things that the corals want and the shellfish, it's also declining. You see, it starts off, sorry, these numbers are a little difficult to see. It starts off at about 240. Remember that magic word, 240? And it is declining. It is declining. So the availability of carbon ions for corals to make their skeletons is declining rapidly. It's going to be about 70 micromoles per kilogram, 70 by the end of the century. From 240 to 70. And all those corals are going to be competing for those few little carbonate ions to build their skeletons. And this is what happens. This is what happens to our baby coral when it doesn't have enough carbonate ions to build its skeleton. So you remember this was the 3-day-old skeleton that I showed you earlier of the very happy coral growing in very happy conditions. It has 240 carbonate ions to work with. By the middle of the century, those baby corals aren't looking very happy at all. In fact, the whole skeleton is quite distorted. It's not able to put down as much carbonate as it needs, calcium carbonate or aragonite as it needs, to make a healthy, strong skeleton that can withstand that wave action on the reef. And by the time we get to the end of the century, we're at 72. The concentration is less than a third of what it's supposed to be. And those baby corals aren't making it at all at this point. In fact, when we run these experiments, we have almost 100% mortality on the baby corals in both these conditions and these conditions. In this condition, the baby corals just die much more quickly after a few days. And do you remember I told you about how carefully those baby corals make the crystals and bundle them up into beautiful, perfect bundles of long, thin crystals? Well, by the end of the century, they're doing something quite different. They can't make those long, beautiful crystals. They're making short, fat crystals that are all misaligned in all different directions. And in fact, if you stuck your finger into these crystals, they just crumble apart. They're not held together by anything. This is an image of a coral Astraea, another species of mounding coral. And what happens when these corals are exposed to conditions 72 that we're expecting for the end of the century? The skeleton completely disappears. They're left naked and defenseless. These corals are not building reefs. They're not providing calcium carbonate to replenish the reef. And a reef, quite frankly, a coral reef with those naked corals is just going to dissolve away. Because nature is going to continue to erode it, and there's going to be nothing left to replace it. So, my lab and a number of other research groups are starting to go out onto reefs and see what's happening, and see whether the changes in carbonate chemistry and the changes in ocean temperature, all caused by human burning of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, what impact this is happening on corals out there, on real reefs, out of our labs. And this is a study from the Great Barrier Reef by some colleagues at the Australian Institute for Marine Science. What they did, they took samples of corals all along the North Queensland coast, all along the length of that Great Barrier Reef. I think they took like 600 samples. And they measured the growth rates of the corals. And here's the year from 1900 to 2000. That's about 12 years ago. And on this axis is coral growth rate. So you can see that for the majority of the time, the corals are maintaining a growth rate of about 1.7. The units don't matter. But what's happening now across the Great Barrier Reef is dramatic declines in coral growth. So we're starting to see that the corals are not able to produce calcium carbonate at the rate that they really need to in order to replenish the reefs. Another thing we're doing is going to places where, for some reason or other, the conditions are a little bit more acidic, or a lot more acidic in some cases, than they are in the open ocean. And we take samples of the corals and we look at how the skeletal structure is impacted by those acidic conditions. And in that case, what we do is we take the coral samples and we bring them back to Woods Hole, where we put them on a CAT scanner, on a CAT scan bed, like a patient. In fact, we have to enter the name of the coral and the way it's lying into the computer program. And then the skeleton, the sample that we've taken goes through the CAT scanner. And then what we can see is we can see inside the sample. We can see inside the coral skeleton. We can see inside that skeleton that is produced, that calcium carbonate that is produced. And what we see in these corals from the more acidic places is that they're heavily bored. They're being penetrated and invaded by other coral reef organisms that see that these corals aren't able to grow normally, and so they invade them. They burrow into the skeletons. And of course, these corals don't do very well. They don't grow very fast. They don't grow very long. They don't last very long. Another way that we've been able to study the impact of ocean acidification or elevated carbon dioxide levels on coral reefs is to go to sites where CO2 or carbon dioxide bubbles are venting out of the bottom of the reef. And this is a site in Papua New Guinea, where some colleagues also from Australia, recently conducted a study. Now these vent sites, where the CO2 is bubbling up, these are transient events. So there was once a coral reef here, and about 50 years ago, carbon dioxide started bubbling through into this area. These they're called CO2 vent sites. And what we see over that time period is complete decimation of the coral reef. There are practically no corals alive in this photograph here. Rather, the old reef is covered with algae. Everything's dead, and all that's there are algae. Now I wanted to show you some reports. And these reports were in response, a number of different newspapers, a number of different journalists, in response to the US Department of Energy's report saying that, gee, we're actually emitting a lot more carbon dioxide than we thought, or than we hoped for. And we're kind of on the worst case scenario route for CO2 emissions across the century. I actually got this from Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera put out a report. Global carbon dioxide output soaring. Scientific American, beyond the worst case climate change scenario. Global CO2 emissions are rising faster than the worst case scenarios. And by the worst case scenarios, what we mean is when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts out the report, they say, well, here's the different scenarios for CO2 emissions, and this is what we think the worst could possibly be. Right? Well, we've exceeded the worst. That 3 times higher in the last decade, that's exceeding our worst expectation. So things are actually pretty bad. Greenhouse gases rise by record amount. This is not only referring to the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, which is significantly higher, almost twice that it's been in the last million years, but it's the rate at which humans continue to pour the carbon dioxide out. And the bottom line is that it's us. It's us. I wanted to show you these data. This is total carbon dioxide emissions per country. And the red is per country. China, the US, India, Russia, Japan, Germany, Iran. Goes on. This is my home country where I was born, South Africa. And the black is the per capita emission, so the per person. So we know that China's exceeded the US in total emissions per country. And it's reflected here in the red bar. Here's China. 200 petagrams carbon. Here's the US, slightly behind China. But when you look at the per capita in the black, each person in this country is actually emitting a lot more carbon dioxide than each person is in China. That's the bottom line. And I know it's not an easy issue. It's not an easy problem to overcome. I mean, I drove up here today from Cape Cod, and I suppose I could have taken the train if I'd been on time. But I drove up here, and I thought about this as I was driving up here. And I want you to think about this when you drive away from here, or take the train. Are these our future reefs? These mounds that are covered with algae, lifeless, otherwise lifeless? Or are these our future reefs? I've just come back from here, the most magnificent place on earth. A coral reef in the far western Pacific, yet untouched by climate change. I think this could be our future. I hope it will. I have 2 young children. And I certainly would like them to be able to see what I've seen and benefit from the amazing diversity and ecosystem services that these reefs provide. I want to end my talk just by thanking a lot of people who help to make our research happen, who help us to see the world and to see what's going on. These are just a few people in my research group. This is Hannah. Hannah's actually here tonight, and she was just with me on Palau, taking samples of corals and water samples. We're trying to figure out where on the map, on the ocean acidification map, Palau is right now. And my postdoc, Katie Schamberger, who makes a lot of measurements of ocean chemistry, and my research assistant, wherever we go in the world, we always get a lot of help from local people. And we find, especially in coral reef countries, people have a very keen awareness of the importance of their reefs. And they're always very keen to know what we found. And usually when we go, they want us to give a talk and tell them what we found and be involved in what we're doing. And so we always get a lot of help, and we surely need it. This thing weighs 350 pounds. And that's one of my students is Draco, who studies the baby corals that I showed you. And my very close colleague, Dan McCorkle, who's a chemical oceanographer. Now, of course, this research and going out in the world and figuring out what's going on and monitoring what's going on takes a lot of money. And I'm also very grateful to my funding agencies, or my sources of funding. Most of our money comes from the National Science Foundation. Some of it comes from my own institution, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We also receive money from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, through their Sea Grant program. And more recently, we've partnered with the Nature Conservancy, who are very concerned about impacts of climate change on reefs, and specifically from a people perspective, trying to institute and prepare for climate adaptation when these reefs do start to go down. So the Nature Conservancy has actually even given us some money to go and find and monitor what's going on in these reefs. So that's the end of my story. I hope that I have shown you something today that you didn't know before. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.